večer, dragi gledatelji, dobrodošli u još jedan večeras imam kolegu za gosta, ali vrlo posebnog kolegu. Hansom Knoop, ako dobro izgovaram, dolazi nam originalno iz Nizozemske. Rođen je tijekom Drugog svjetskog rata kao skriveno židovsko dijete, ali najpoznatije po tome jer je 4 godine svog života potrošio na vrlo korisnu stvar. Naime, u 35 ili 40 zemalja je prikazan taj dokumentarac o lovu na jednog od najvećih nacističkih zločinaca Europe, a svakako najvećeg nacističkog zločinca Nizozemske, pa ćemo danas porazgovarati, naravno, uvodno o tome, a onda i o svim ostalim pitanjima koja su su pripadna sa Hansom Knoopom. Dobro večer i dobrodošli.
Thanks. First of all, thanks for having me. I feel really flattered to be on your show. And I'm ready to answer all your questions, as far as I am able to do that. But I will do my very best.
Sasvim sigurno jeste. Vi ste kolega, pa ste pripravni na sve vrste pitanja, jer moram i to kazati, Hansom Knoop je dobio nagradu kao najbolji novinar naprosto Izraela. Razgovarao sa svim prominentnim predsjednicima svijeta, pa o tome ćemo razgovarati, dakle, o razgovorima sa Nixonom i inima, ali da ne duljim, idemo step by step. Najzanimljivije je zapravo pitanje, ono što nikad nisam imao prigodu pitati nikoga u ovoj emisiji, radimo ovakve stvari 30 i nešto godina, jest koji je bio motiv da se upustite, kasnije ćemo kazati koji je taj čovjek, nešto ćemo kazati o njegovoj biografiji, predstavit ćemo tog zločinca, ali koji je bio vaš motiv da se upustite u tako opasnu stvar i koji su vas problemi pratili na tom putu do razotkrivanja tog nacističkog zločinca?
Well, first of all, I was not that keen on doing a story. I was tipped off by a lady who I knew. And she told me that this guy who lived very close to the place where we lived at the time, when I was still living in Holland, maybe 10 kilometers away from our village, this guy was living. I never heard of him. But the lady tipped me off and told me that this guy is going to hold an auction. He's going to sell part of his enormous art collection through an auction at Sotheby's in Amsterdam. But most of the art has been stolen during the Second World War. This guy lived in Poland before the war, and during the war, he is a Dutch guy, but he moved to Poland already in the 20s. And during the occupation of Poland, he has been stealing and looting like mad. And in the middle of the war, he came back to Holland with a full train, I think with something like 10 wagons loaded with stolen art. And this guy is going to sell part of that collection through an auction in Amsterdam. And you should do everything to stop it. That's what the lady asked me. A couple of days before, this guy gave a huge interview to Holland's largest daily newspaper, The Telegraph, one of the biggest on the European continent, in which he told the readers that he was about to auction part of his collection, and he also talked a little bit about his past, that he had lived in Poland before the war and that he went back in the middle of the war. Of course, he didn't speak about any crimes, he didn't speak about any looting. Well, as this story, as this interview with him appeared in The Telegraph, and I was working for a political news magazine which belonged to the same company, I went to see the editor-in-chief of The Telegraph because the interview has been placed in The Telegraph. So I told the editor-in-chief, you should assign a reporter and check that case because there is a good story in it. I didn't want to do it myself because I was the editor-in-chief of that political news magazine like Der Spiegel or L'Express or Time magazine. So the editor-in-chief said, okay, I will ask a reporter to check on it. I knew, of course, the guy. I knew the reporter. A couple of days later, I met him in the canteen where we were having lunch, and I asked him, when is your story coming? He said, I'm not going to do a story. I went to see to the War Documentary Institute in Amsterdam, and they have nothing about him. So I'll leave it alone. And I found that a very strange answer, because it's a good story, especially because there was a guy in Israel, a journalist, working for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, and he knew Menton, because both of them lived in the same village in Poland before the war. Canaan emigrated to Palestine, I think somewhere in 1936, and he knew Menton very well. And he told everyone that Menton had killed his entire family during the Second World War.
Na ovom mjestu možda je dobro da kažemo nešto o Pieteru Nikolasu Mentenu. Dakle, on je u to vrijeme o kojem govorite, kad je počinio te zločine, živio u Galiciji. Nakon toga, dakle, odlazi natrag, postaje kolekcionar i tako dalje, ali ono što je, evo, njegova fotografija, ono u čemu je zapravo njegov krimen jest ubojstvo 25 poljskih profesora. Dakle, on je čak rekao da bi ubio i više da ih je našao. Dakle, ali ne samo da je išao ubijati sve oni koji su članovi akademije, dakle, među njima 25 tih profesora, nego su tu bile ubijeni i njihove obitelji. Jesam li dobro opisao te zločine, nisam nešto propustio?
Yes, he even lived in the house of one of those professors who he had murdered, Professor Ostrovsky, in Lvov, Lemberg at the time. He was engaged in the professor murder, which is a very known historic fact which happened during the occupation. But he also murdered the relatives of this guy, Canaan, who emigrated to Israel in 1936. So I got the phone number of Canaan, and I also gave it to that reporter in Amsterdam, but he didn't want to contact him. So I was amazed, such a good story. There is a guy in Israel accusing a multimillionaire in Holland that he has killed his entire family, and you are not doing a story. So if you don't do it, then I do it myself. And I anticipated that it would just be one story, a very easy story from a journalistic point of view. Interview Canaan, who accuses Menton of war crimes, and then, of course, go to Menton and ask for his comment. And that's what I did. So at a Saturday morning in June 1976, I went to see Menton in his mansion, again, very close to where we lived. And I told him on the phone that I also wanted to do a story on his art auction. So he was amazed and he was flattered that another magazine after the Telegraph would pay attention to the sale of his art. So I went there, and immediately after, when we were facing each other, I immediately told him, Mr. Menton, let me be fair. I'm not here to interview you on the upcoming art auction in Amsterdam. I'm here for another reason. You are accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. There is a guy in Israel, and he knew you, and he knows you very well.
Ovo je, dakle, Menton tijekom tog svog nacističkog
Yes, this is Menton in uniform, in Nazi uniform. I need to stress...
Treba kazati samo, prostite, da je tada na tom području, dakle, Galicije, naravno prisutna njemačka vojska.
Yes, in September 1939, Germany declared war upon Poland. Poland was already divided in two sections due to the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement. Menton had all his property in the Russian-occupied part of Poland. So imagine what happened with his wealth. When the Russians occupied eastern Galicia, he lost all his property.
Da, to je zanimljivo zakazati, da on bio zapravo miran i povučen posljednjih velikih zemlje u Galiciji i ništa nije ukazivalo na to da će se njegov život razvijeti u tom smjeru.
No, it was a tremendous shock for him when I touched his alleged war past. I say alleged because I had no proof other than the accusation of Haviv Canaan in Israel, who on the record accused him of having murdered his entire family. Now, I did one story, accusation versus denial by Mentena, and I thought that's it. But that was only the beginning, because people were going to call me, and I got more and more evidence. It went on and on and on. Every new week, every new issue, I came up with new evidence, with new stories. And then, just to make a jump, in the autumn of '76, I, to my big surprise, did get a visa to go to Galicia, to the Ukraine, which was then Soviet territory, Soviet Union. And Soviet soldiers opened up the mass graves of Menten's victims in my presence. And the entire population, all those peasants, were standing near that grave, and they were also standing there when the execution took place, 35 years before. So I could interview one witness after the other, standing near that open grave where the remains of their relatives were brought up, digged up and brought to the surface.
Samo kratko, koliko je ukupno to žrtava bilo, za koje je recimo on kriv?
The ones we have investigated were about 200 in Potoroce. That's the place where Canaan's family lived. And in the nearby neighboring village of Uric, another 200. But I'm sure that the total number is much higher. But we concentrated on these two villages because we could find witnesses which were still alive. Of course, I also knew about the professor murder in Lemberg. We went to the place where Menten lived in Lemberg, and that was in the house of Professor Ostrovsky, who he had murdered too. But as for the investigation and later on the trial against Menten, we were only fixed on Potoroce and Uric, and these were the two places where the Soviet soldiers opened the grave.
Sad ću ja napraviti skok. Koliko je godina dobio za to na kraju suđenja?
The first sentence he received was 15 years. And then he appealed, and the appeal court reduced the sentence. He appealed a couple of times, but the final sentence was 10 years.
Kolege u Nizozemskoj su govorile da ste unijeli previše zapravo osobnog angažmana u sve to. Biste li posvetili sve te godine života lovu na Mentena, a da niste Židov?
That's very hard to answer. You can never know how you would behave if you wouldn't be you. I'm who I am. I'm a journalist. I'm after a good story. And I'm a very passionate Jew. And also members of my family were murdered, not by Menten, but by Nazis, with whom he collaborated. By the way, Menten never joined the SS or any German corps. The photo you are showing in the uniform, he was allowed to wear the uniform for his own protection. But technically, he never joined the SS. He was very friendly with General Eberhard Schöngard, who was the head of the SD, Sicherheitsdienst in Poland, that became his friend. He was stealing and robbing together with Schöngert, and Schöngert allowed him to wear the uniform of an officer.
On se više interesira za umjetnost.
He was more interested in art.
Moram biti ovako ciničan. Ja sam uzeo...
No, listen, he had very personal
friends
with... He had very close relations with the Jews before the war.
Da.
I don't even think that he was an anti-Semite. He was just an opportunist.
Stravično. On se zapravo, da, lopina. Uzeo sam ove dvije stranice da pokažem. Ovo je biografija, pa neću čitati sve što moj gost je, ali samo ću kazati dvije stvari. Ne samo da ste intervjuirali gotovo sve poznate predsjednike unazad, recimo, 30-40 godina, nego ste i ratni bio dopisnik, tako da ćemo razgovarati malo o tome. Ali ajmo onda ubrzati stvari. O svemu ovo napravljena je dramska serija. U koliko zemalja i jeste li zadovoljni njome? To je 35 zemalja za sad, koliko ja znam. Ili više?
Well, I had nothing to do with the TV show. It was a drama series. It was a production company which produced the series. It was aired on Dutch national TV. It had the highest ratings ever on Channel 2. Normally, Channel 2 is the drama channel, and it got a tremendous review. It has been repeated 3 times on Dutch television, and it has been sold, as far as I know, I think to something like 34 countries in the world where it has been aired with tremendous success. It got the Rocky Award in Canada, which is one of the highest awards in the TV movie industry.
Pitam to zato što kao posebno pitanje za sljedeće. Vi ste sami involvirani u pisanje i izradu jedne takove dramske serije, a ona će biti posvećena Nizozemskom židovskom vijeću. Što je tu toliko posebno i recite našim gledateljima, jer ne mogu pretpostaviti da su familijarni uopće sa tim pojmom, što je to Nizozemsko židovsko vijeće i zašto baš o tome radite dokumentarnu seriju?
First of all, I did a book which is more or less considered to be a standard work on the Dutch Jewish Council. It was published in 1982. The Dutch Jewish, or the Amsterdam Jewish Council, is unique in occupied Europe for a number of reasons. First of all, because the leadership was the same leadership of the Jewish community before the war. In Eastern Europe, where there were Judenrats, the leadership of the Judenrats was second choice because the pre-war leadership didn't want to collaborate with the Nazis. So only the second echelon was sitting in the Judenrat. This was not the case in Holland. It were the same people who were the leaders of the Jewish community before the war who became the leaders of the Judenrat in Amsterdam. They were instrumental, of course, under pressure. They didn't do it voluntarily, and they didn't do it out of collaboration, but they were forced to cooperate with the Germans to deport 104,000 Jews to the gas chambers. Holland had the highest percentage of deported Jews after Poland. And this is mainly due to the cooperation of the Amsterdam Judenrat. But if you study who they were and how they acted, you get more and more fascinated because they were good people. They were responsible people. They took up that position because they found that someone needed to represent the Jews. Take into consideration that the Jews were isolated during the occupation. The Dutch authorities couldn't be of any assistance to them. That was the whole system of the Nazis. Isolate them first and deport them afterwards. During that isolation, only the Dutch Judenrat could take care of interests concerning the Jewish community. They needed to create their own schools. They needed to create their own hospitals. They were not allowed to have any contact with the outside world anymore. So somebody needed to take care of their daily needs. And the Dutch Judenrat did so, and they did it with great success, because no one died of hunger in the Netherlands during the occupation, at least no Jew. But of course, they were deported.
I to 80%. To nas sad vodi u novo pitanje. Vi ste se u jednom trenutku iselili iz Nizozemske u Belgiju. Ima tu cijeli niz pitanja. Recite mi, je li to zbog pritisaka? Nas prvo kratko pritam. Jeste li se...
No, let me be very clear about that. We lived in Belgium already before. I lived in Belgium from 71 till 75. I was the Brussels correspondent of newspaper The Telegraph and of national Dutch radio and television, covering the European Union. It was called different at the time, but it was the European Union, NATO and Belgium. Belgium was, of course, also important.
Evo i to ste bili, zato vas nisam predstavljao. Vi ste bili zapravo sve u svom novinarskom vijeku, tako da mi je drago da otkrivate sloj po sloj vašeg angažmana. Izvolite.
Yes. In 1975, I was called back from Brussels to become the editor of that political news magazine. But we loved, my wife, myself, my kids, we loved Belgium. So when I was called back to Amsterdam, I told my wife, whenever there is an opportunity to return to Belgium, we will do so. And that moment was there when my both kids were on their own, were adults, not living at home anymore. So then we decided to go back. So we are living there since 1990.
Znate zašto vas to pitam? Zato što Nizozemska ima izuzetno dobar imidž. Delom to zbog onog perioda kad ste vi otišli prvi put u Amsterdam, kad je dominirala hipi kultura i tad ste postali izvjestitelj. Dakle, liberalni svijet, eto, odnosi su manje više takvi kakvi jesu, uzoriti civilizacijski odnosi Evrope, da sad ne fraziram. U svakom slučaju svi znamo što je naše kolektivne predstavi Nizozemska. Ali u ovom smislu 80% židovske populacije u Nizozemskoj deportirano, a 45% u Belgiji. Otkud onda te dobar imidž Nizozemske?
I'm glad that you're asking that question. I tried to answer that question also in a documentary which I made and which was aired, I think, something like 3 years ago. You're absolutely right. Holland has done perfect PR in the world. If you go to the United States and you tell that you're a Dutch Jew, people believe that 99% of the Dutch Jews were rescued by that brave Dutch people, but they're absolutely wrong. The percentage of deported Jews, as what I said, after Poland, is the highest during the occupation. Also due to the fact that the Queen of the Netherlands fled to England. She didn't stay in Holland. So there was no leadership anymore. As for Belgium, the Belgian royal family stayed in Brussels. The Queen Mother, Elizabeth, tried whatever she could to save Jewish kids from deportation. She's the only royal, by the way, who got the Yad Vashem award because of her help to rescue Jewish kids. You had a far better chance as a Jew to survive in Belgium than in the Netherlands. Again, for a number of reasons. The Dutch Queen was in London. She was not in Holland anymore. The Dutch Queen also didn't touch the isolation and deportation of Jews during her radio broadcasts. She had broadcasts from London aimed at occupied Holland. Everyone in Holland was listening to her broadcast. I think only twice she mentioned the fate of the Jews in the Netherlands, but she never encouraged the Dutch people to come to the rescue of Jews and help and save them. Just imagine if such an appeal would have been made by the Queen. far more Jews would have been saved. She didn't touch the subject at all. So this is another reason why things went wrong in the Netherlands. And compared to Belgium, there was another element, and then I finish my history lesson, and that's Holland had an SS occupation. Belgium had a Wehrmacht occupation. Holland had an SS occupation. The highest German official in the Netherlands was Rijkskommissar, Rijksminister Seyss-Inquart. So only Poland and Holland had that type of German occupation, and that's a big difference.
Da, razumijemo to. Ovdje, znate, na području ovoga Hrvatske jako dobro znamo te nijanse. Recite mi još jedno privatno pitanje, ali koje se da poopćiti i puno govori o tom odnosu. Naime, ova emisija, kao i neke koje zadnje vrijeme radim, jest sa svrhom da pokaže kako to izgleda u zapadnoj Europi. Nikad o tome ne govorim. Uvijek se govori manje više o istočnoj Europi, jer su naravno i logori bili većma na ovom prostoru, ili su najviše žrtava stradale u tim logorima. Ali zanimljivo čuti kako to izgleda kad se govori o tim zemljama koje su nama paradigma uzoritosti i uljuđenosti. Zašto se niste iselili u Izrael? Vi kažete da poznajete tu zemlju bolje od bilo koga. Imali ste naravno prilike i poziva.
My wife had lived in Israel. She's Dutch, but she had lived in Israel. She came back because she needed an operation which they couldn't do in Israel, so she came back temporarily to the Netherlands to have that operation, and I met her in Holland, and that meant that she didn't go back to Israel anymore. Of course, we have considered going to Israel many, many times. And in 78, I got an invitation by the late Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who was a friend of us. And when he won the elections, I got a call and was asked to become part of his press spokesman division at the Prime Minister's office. But that would have meant that we would have to emigrate. Our kids didn't speak any Hebrew. It came at the wrong time, and I had to reject it. Half a year later, Sadat came to Israel, and I was watching the images on TV, looking at Sadat coming down the stairs of the plane, and then being greeted by Menachem Begin on the platform of Ben Gurion Airport. That was a historic event, and I told my wife, just imagine if I would have said yes, I would have been standing there now. But now I'm watching television like anyone else. But I don't regret it. Of course, our heart is partly in Israel. My wife's family lives there. She has lived there. Her mother, so my mother-in-law, has died there. I read 3 to 4 Israeli newspapers per day. There's nothing happening in Israel without my knowledge. That's what, at least, I feel. Everything happening there, I consume like mad. I'm addicted to Israel. But I'm also very critical with Israel.
U kom smislu? Što ne valja?
There are things happening which I don't like and which I find wrong, counterproductive, and in some cases even un-Jewish. For example, the settlement policy I definitely do reject. I'm not saying that Israel has no right to be on the West Bank, or that Jews have no right to be in the West Bank. Times where Judenreine, Jew, cleaned of Jews, areas cleaned of Jews do not exist anymore, and especially not in the Jewish land. So I feel that Jews do have fundamentally the right to live wherever they like. But on the other hand, I find the settlements counterproductive to find a lasting solution with the Palestinians. And I think such a solution is not only morally necessary, but it's also in the interest of Israel. It's impossible that any nation can remain an occupational force forever. We have seen other, even stronger empires collapse because of occupation. The Romans went down. Well, whatever you want, Napoleon collapsed. Nazi Germany collapsed. Why should Israel be the only country in the world which will succeed in keeping certain territories occupied forever? It's only a temporary thing. And I think it should be ended, not only out of compassion with Palestinians, but primarily in the interest of Israel itself.
Spominjali smo par puta, pa sad ste i sami spomenuli Begina koji je prijatelj vaše obitelji, ali naročit prijatelj sa vama. Radili ste jasno intervju sa njim. Mislim da imamo i negdje sliku, ali nije sada važno. U svakom slučaju, evo, prije sam spomenuo Nixona, razgovarali ste sa Huseinom, da ne nabrajam sad kraljicu, jasno, to neću ni spominjati, to se podrazumijeva. Tko je od vas ostavio, ovako mene kao kolegu, zanima, ko je na vas ostavio najveći dojam?
Oh, I have no doubt that the one who made the biggest impression on me was Menachem Begin. Of course, I knew his past, I knew his history before I met him for the first time. I know that he himself is a Holocaust survivor. He's the only Israeli prime minister who was a Holocaust survivor. All his predecessors and those who succeeded him were either born in Israel or already went to Israel before the Holocaust. He is the only one who experienced the Holocaust personally, and he personally witnessed the murder of his family. So that's part of his personality. And then he was taken prisoner, being brought to Siberia, where he was held in Siberian Russian prison camp. Later on, joined the Free Polish Army, and then stayed in Palestine to become leader of the Irgun Zweilumi, the resistance organization which fought against the British. He was always considered to be a horrible person by let's say, the elite in Israel. Israel had a social democratic government from the beginning in 1948 until 1978 when Begin took over. And the social democracy in Israel painted him actually as kind of a fascist. It was horrible, the accusations and the slander they put on him. So I was curious to meet him, and from that very first visit, we became friends. He stayed also in our house when he visited the Netherlands. And I was very, very much impressed by him. Way more than any other leader I met. He was a man of 18-carat democratic ideas and opinions. He was loyal. He was a great speaker. He had charisma. And he came also at the right time. He was the one who made peace for the first time with Egypt. All his predecessors, Golda Meir, Yitzhak Rabin, you name them, Levi Eshkol, all of them failed to make peace with Egypt. And they were the big peacemakers. They presented themselves always as the peacemakers, but there was no partner. So they said, well, we want peace, but we have no partner. Only when Begin took over, half a year later, Sadat came to Israel. And that was a game changer. A totally different situation erupted as a result of the historic visit of President Sadat to Israel.
Vi imate ovaj otklon i jedinstvena prilika postaviti nekome ko živi, eto, ko živi u Nizozemskoj, pa Belgiji, pa Nizozemskoj, ovako pitanje, upravo zato što uvijek možete gledati iz te izraelske perspektive ili kao Židov. Kako taj dio svijeta gleda na ovaj naš dio svijeta ovdje i vrijedi li, recimo, u Nizozemskoj Belgiji predrasuda u ovom dijelu svijeta kao nečem primitivnom, balkanskom, nečem što proizvodi, kako je rekao Churchill, previše povijesti, čemu su, taj se dio nikad ne citira i zaboravlja se reći, dokaz preširoka groblja, a pogotovo gledali na nas ovdje, mislim sad ja nas ne branim, da se razumijemo, mislim pogotovo ne u svjetlu rata od prije 30 godina, a da ne spominjamo onaj tamo od prije, dakle drugi svjetski, koliko 70 i nešto, sa svim ovim žrtvama holokausta i genocida i ostaloga. Ali, sad kad slušamo evo, po drugi put unazad jedno 2-3 mjeseca o tome što se sve zbivalo u Nizozemskoj, Belgiji i tako dalje, recite mi kako taj dio svijeta gleda na ovaj dio Europe? Je li Europa, jedinstvena Europa u tom smislu moguća? Postoje li dvije Europe? I usput rečeno, ako se već gleda von oben na ovaj dio svijeta, kako je objašnjeno recimo to da se na stadionima diljem Nizozemske skandira ponovo o Židovima koji bi trebali završiti u plinskim komorama? To cijeli stadion skandira. I otkud recimo taj antisemitizam koji nije novijeg karaktera samo zbog imigracija. To je stari antisemitizam u Belgiji, Nizozemskoj i svugdje po zapadnoj Europi.
Well, if I look at the Balkan or Eastern Europe, of course the general idea among Jews in Western Europe is that most of the Eastern European countries, including the Balkan countries, have long anti-Semitic tradition. Two countries in particular, of course, have a very negative image and reputation. First of all, Poland, with deeply rooted anti-Semitism going back for centuries. And then, of course, I'm sorry to say it because I'm your guest, Croatia is not very popular either.
Ne morate se ispričavati, mislim, svrha ovakvih programa je da se čovjek suoči sa istinom.
So we are not very charmed by Eastern Europeans, but they gradually became democratic states. They're part of Europe, and it's either with them or the Russians will try to expand their influence on them. So I think the best way to get rid of all those deeply rooted anti-Semitic, xenophobic attitudes in this part of Europe, the best way to get rid of it is being part of the other Europe, which is the European Union, which has democratic values, which respects human rights. So things are turning the right direction. Of course, if I see demonstrators shouting that to the Jews in Poland only a couple of months ago, you have the idea that nothing really changed. That's not true. Things have changed. Of course, there are still strong anti-Semitic undercurrents in this part of Europe, but there is not a single anti-Semitic state in Europe anymore. There may be anti-Semites among the population, even among politicians, but there is no anti-Semitic state. Not a single state spreads anti-Semitism. They're all, let's say, respect the rules, the laws and bylaws of the European Union. They're part of the European family, and they need to comply with the standards we all have agreed upon. So that's the positive thing. Just to give an example, I'm sure that there is still a lot of anti-Semitism in Hungary as well. Nevertheless, Orban, who is very often called an anti-Semite himself, but nevertheless, also Orban, let's say, respects the values of the European Union. Maybe not by heart. Maybe he thinks differently, but at least he is part of the family and behaves. And that's, I think, a big advantage. That's why I'm very, very pro-European. I don't understand those people criticizing Europe and being against the European Union. Due to the European Union, Europe hasn't seen war for 75 years. Can you imagine if there would be no European Union, how the situation would be in this part of the world today? Would have been wars all over.
Nažalost, na tlu Evrope se ipak desio rat i Evropska unija nije tu puno učinila. I ne samo to, nego sad ja moram kazati još jednu strašnu stvar o ovim krajevima. Eto, 60. godina nakon Drugog svjetskog rata ponovo su bili otvoreni logori. Desio se genocid, desila se ta Srebrenica. Dakle, nema govora da smo mi nešto naučili iz povijesti, ali idemo na jedno drugo pitanje. Vi ste bili dopisnik u cijelim nizu ratova, eto, šestodnevnom Jom Kipurskom ratu, bili ste svugdje po svijetu. Imate vrlo velike iskustva s time. Dvije situacije me trenutno u svijetu zanimaju. Kako vi gledate sa tim velikim iskustvom na ove odnose, dakle, Ukrajine i Rusije? I što mislite što će biti u perspektivi, jer razgovarajući i sa veleposlanicima Izraela, pogotovo sam jednu veliku analizu ovdje sa prethodnom veleposlanicom Izraela, ne sa gospodinom Morom, ali i sa njim sam razgovarao o tome, ali cijelu emisiju sam posvetio zapravo o izraelsko-iranskom kompleksu odnosa. I tu je jedan plan koji se rasteže na 20-30 godina od strane Irana. Kako gledate, dakle, s jedne strane na ovu aktualnu situaciju, kako gledate na ovu dugotrajnu situaciju ukoliko finiširaju nekakvim ratovima?
Well, you were asking two questions at the same time. As for the Ukraine, first of all, let me be clear, I'm not an expert on Eastern European politics. But with my experience, I know, of course, that Russia will do what it finds necessary to do. It won't listen to the rest of the world if it finds that its own interests are being jeopardized or violated. And let's be honest, Ukraine is part of the Russian sphere of interest. It has been part of the Soviet Union. It was given back to the Ukrainians as a gift. And now Putin wants it back again. First of all, he took back the Crimea. There was a lot of noise in the world and a lot of threats of boycott, but he didn't leave. Crimea is now part of Russia. Despite all the criticism, despite of the sanctions, he took it and he keeps it. And I have no doubt that the very same can happen with Ukraine. There will be a lot of noise. If he invades Ukraine tomorrow with 200,000 soldiers, there will be a huge outcry in the world, shame and this and that, and there will be an extra session of the Security Council, but nothing will happen. Because whatever we think about it, Ukraine belongs to the Russian sphere of interest. If he steps 1 meter across the border of Latvia or Estonia, that's a different thing, because then he enters NATO territory. Ukraine is not NATO territory. It belongs historically to the former Soviet Union, historically to Russia. So if Russia finds it necessary to invade the Ukraine, it will do so, and the rest of the world will just watch and will not do anything at all. Now up to Israel and Iran. This is a thing which is going on already for 20, 30 years. Iran wants to become a nuclear power. It's enriching uranium to levels possible to produce nuclear weapons. It has never made a secret that it wants to do that. It never made a secret that it wants to use those weapons. Israel also has nuclear weapons, but it doesn't use them. It will only use them in case of an apocalyptic situation. There have been 2 wars, 67, the Six-Day War, and 73, the Yom Kippur War. And especially the Yom Kippur War was a very, very tricky war. Israel was on the verge of collapse in the first week. Nevertheless, Israel did not use its nuclear weapons. As for Iran, things are different. The Ayatollahs, the regime, has made it clear they want to wipe Israel from the map. And they will use any tool at their disposal to achieve that goal, whether it is with conventional weapons, whether it is with nuclear weapons. This is the scenario, and I'm very, very afraid that one day we will be in the middle of a horrible war in the Middle East between Israel and Iran. If Israel will attack Iranian nuclear sites, it's obvious that Iran will, how do you say, will ask Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in the south in Gaza to participate in a war. So then we have a war in the north with Hezbollah, we have a war in the south with Hamas, and we have a war with Lebanon, with Iran, using hundreds of guided missiles aimed at Israel. It will be a massacre. It will be a massacre, but I'm absolutely sure that Israel will survive and will be victorious. And I'm also sure that Israel will attack once it feels necessary to do so in order to keep on living, because this is the most serious threat ever on the future of the Jewish people since Hitler came to power.
Jako crna tema, jako crni scenarij. Imamo 2 minute do kraja emisije. Živite, dakle, u srcu Europske unije. Samo kratka, dakle, slika. Što vi mislite kakva je budućnost Europske unije? Hoće li snažiti prema nekakvom jedinstvu ili će dezintegracija uslijediti?
I'm sure that it will remain united, because there are lots of things which need to be improved. I'm not saying that everything is perfect in the European Union. Many things should and will be improved. But the alternative is no Europe without the European Union, and not a single state in Europe is strong enough to resist, for example, big powers like China, the United States. We need to have a united Europe to be an important player on the world field wherever we need to be present. This can only be done with the united Europe.
Hvala vam lijepo na vašem dolasku u ovu emisiju. Hvala što ste evo prvi puta u Hrvatskoj samo da biste bili gost ove emisije. To mi laska, pogotovo s toga što nakon ovakvog životnog puta čovjek ne može poželjeti imati boljeg gosta, a da mu je kolega. A vi ste novinar cijeli svoj život u svim mogućim žanrovima i zaista imponirate u tome. Hvala puno. I čestitam vam naravno poslije kraljice koja vam je poslala i posebnu zahvalu na 50 i toliko godina braka. To ćete mi privatno kazati odgovor što je recept. Hvala vam lijepo još jednom. Dragi gledatelji, hvala vama što ste bili sa nama. Gledajte nas naravno i sljedeće srijede, a do tada doviđenja.